There are weapons orbiting over your head right now, and I guarantee most people don't even know they exist. Not nuclear warheads, those are banned. Not laser death rays, those are science fiction. But the US Space Force's satellite jammers? Operational since March 2020, and they can shut down enemy communications from the ground. Russia fires missiles that shatter satellites into thousands of pieces of debris. China tracks every movement of American forces with surveillance satellites that never blink. And all of this happens in a realm that was supposed to be, according to a treaty signed 58 years ago, reserved for peaceful purposes only. Here's the myth Hollywood sold you. Space militarization began with Reagan's Star Wars program in the 1980s, a futuristic dream of laser-armed satellites zapping nuclear missiles. That's not quite right. And honestly, when I started digging into this, I was shocked to discover that space has been militarized since the very beginning, since before humans ever set foot there. The question was never if space would become a battlefield, it was always when we'd stop pretending it wasn't already one. Let's rewind to 1960. The Cold War is at its coldest. The U.S. Naval Research Laboratory quietly launches something called GRAB, Galactic Radiation and Background. Sounds boring, right? It's supposedly studying the sun. But here's the thing. It's actually America's first operational reconnaissance satellite designed to intercept Soviet radar signals. Think about that for a second. The space age is barely 3 years old, and we're already lying about why we're up there. By August 1960, the U.S. launches Discoverer 13, the first successful spy satellite mission under what they called the Corona program. This thing would fly over 100 missions through 1972. The Soviet Union launches its own reconnaissance satellite, Zenit 2, in 1963, photographing American military installations. And you know what's wild? By the mid-1960s, both programs are fully operational, and the Soviets just silently accept it. Because they're doing the exact same thing. From the early 1960s to the mid-1980s, photography from space is often the only way to get critical intelligence on what weapons your adversaries are developing. President Lyndon Johnson once said that spy satellites alone were worth 10 times what America spent on its entire space program. Can you believe that? 10 times. Why? Because they prevented World War III. Here's the uncomfortable truth, and I think this is something most people don't want to hear. Military competition drove the space race, not scientific curiosity. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty, the foundational document of space law, was negotiated specifically because both superpowers were terrified of nuclear weapons in orbit. And they had reason to be. On July 8, 1962, the United States detonated a 1.4 megaton nuclear weapon 400 kilometers above the Pacific Ocean. They called it Starfish Prime. It created an artificial aurora visible from Hawaii and, get this, devastated the space environment so badly that 8 of the 24 satellites in orbit were damaged or destroyed. Space wasn't pristine. It was already a weapons testing range. The Outer Space Treaty was signed January 27, 1967. It prohibits nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in space and bans military bases, weapons testing, or military maneuvers on the moon and other celestial bodies. Sounds comprehensive, right? It isn't. The treaty does not expressly ban all military activities in space, nor the establishment of military space forces, nor the placement of conventional weapons in space. Read that again. Conventional weapons. Satellites that jam. Satellites that ram. Satellites that blind. Those are fair game. The treaty emphasizes peaceful purposes, sure. But what does peaceful even mean? Some analysts think it could broadly prohibit all weapon systems in space, but that interpretation? Contested. debated, ignored. It's a treaty with a canyon-sized loophole, and everyone knows it. Here's what happened. In the early 1960s, the Soviet Union refused to separate outer space issues from disarmament generally. They demanded elimination of U.S. foreign missile bases as a precondition for any space agreement. After the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko changed course and proposed banning orbiting nuclear weapons. The U.S. supported this even without verification provisions, estimating its space tracking systems were adequate for detecting launches. Both sides agreed to ban the most catastrophic weapons, but reconnaissance satellites, communications jammers, anti-satellite missiles? I think you can guess where this is going. Those stayed on the table. Fast forward to March 23, 1983. President Ronald Reagan announces the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, in a televised address, calling for a system that would render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. The media quickly dubs it Star Wars. Senator Ted Kennedy calls it reckless Star Wars schemes the very next day. I mean, the name stuck for a reason. The SDI would use space-based and ground-based laser battle stations, particle beam weapons, and missile interceptors to shoot down Soviet ICBMs at various phases of flight. It's science fiction meets Cold War paranoia. Reagan's interest dates back to 1967 when, as California's governor, he visited physicist Edward Teller and was captivated by directed energy weapons. The guy literally wanted laser beams in space. Reagan was a vocal critic of Mutual Assured Destruction, MAD. He called it a suicide pact. And honestly, he had a point. MAD meant that peace depended on the certainty that using nuclear weapons would annihilate both sides. It was deterrence through guaranteed apocalypse. Who thought that was a good long-term strategy? But here's what actually happened with SDI. Over 10 years, the government spent up to $30 billion developing the concept, but the futuristic program remained just that, futuristic. Many politicians and scientists argued SDI was overambitious from the start, with technical hurdles that seemed insurmountable. You know what I find fascinating? On June 28, 1985, a computer scientist named David Lorge Parnas resigned from SDI's panel on computing, arguing in 8 papers that the software could never be made trustworthy and that such a system would inevitably be unreliable and menace humanity. He joined wanting to make nuclear weapons obsolete, but concluded the whole concept was a fraud. Yet SDI accomplished something Reagan never anticipated. When Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he began drastically cutting military spending, particularly the anti-ballistic missile program the USSR started in response to SDI. In March 1986, Gorbachev told the Politburo, and I love this quote, "Maybe we should just stop being afraid of SDI. They're banking on the USSR's fear of SDI. In moral, economic, political, and military terms, they're pursuing this program to wear us out." He was right. SDI became the primary obstacle to progress in US-Soviet strategic arms dialogue throughout the 1980s. By September 1989, the Soviet Union dropped its requirement that an agreement be reached on SDI before making progress on arms reduction treaties. Star Wars never shot down a single missile, but the threat of it helped bankrupt the Soviet Union and end the Cold War. Whether that was Reagan's plan all along or a magnificent accident, depends on who you ask. I think it was probably both. Now we arrive at today, where the gloves are off and nobody's pretending anymore. On December 20th, 2019, the United States Space Force was established as the 6th branch of the U.S. Armed Forces. Then Defense Secretary Mark Esper declared, "Space has become so important to our way of life, our economy, and our national security that we must be prepared as a nation to protect it from hostile actions." You know what that really means? We're ready to fight for it. The Space Force's mandate is to organize, train, and equip forces to provide freedom of operation in, from, and to space, provide independent military options for national leadership, and enhance the lethality of the joint force. Translation: win wars in space and from space. The Space Force's counter-communications system, developed by L3Harris and declared operational in March 2020, is an electronic jammer designed to disrupt enemy satellite communications signals. Now, here's the thing they'll tell you. The jamming effects are reversible. They cause temporary disruption, not permanent damage. The upgraded version, called Meadowlands, delivered its first unit in April 2025, about 6 months ahead of schedule. The military is installing 24 remote modular terminal jammers, small, transportable, low-cost satellite communications jammers that can be deployed in austere environments. The U.S. is particularly concerned about Chinese Yaogan surveillance satellites providing continuous coverage of the Indo-Pacific to identify gaps in U.S. forces. The jammers, in military speak, will yell in their ear so radars can't command attacks. Think of it like this. Modern war depends on seeing the battlefield. GPS guides bombs. Satellites spot troop movements. Communications links coordinate attacks. Blind those satellites, and you've won before a shot is fired. That's the theory anyway. But if America's building jammers, what are Russia and China building? I'm glad you asked. On November 15, 2021, at around 2:50 UTC, Russia launched an 8235 Nudol anti-ballistic missile and destroyed its own defunct satellite, Cosmos 1408. When I first heard about this, I couldn't believe it. The test generated more than 1,500 pieces of trackable orbital debris and will likely generate hundreds of thousands of pieces of smaller debris. The threat of potential collision with debris caused the crew of the International Space Station, including 2 Russian cosmonauts, to take shelter in their escape capsules for the first few passes of the debris cloud. Let me say that again. Russia endangered its own people to prove it could blow up satellites. While Russia had conducted earlier anti-satellite tests aiming at imaginary points in space, this was the first intercept with Russia's modern system actually destroying a real target. The satellite weighed approximately 3,860 pounds, on the large end of ASAT test targets, generating more debris than necessary. I mean, why pick something small when you can create maximum chaos, right? U.S. Space Command condemned it. The long-lived debris created by this dangerous and irresponsible test will now threaten satellites and other space objects vital to all nations' security, economic, and scientific interests for decades to come. The European Union called it a clear act of irresponsible behavior in outer space. By February 2023, only 300 of the initial 1,790 pieces of debris, 17%, were still in orbit, with increasing solar activity causing debris to decay faster than usual. But some debris from old Soviet ASAT tests over 50 years ago is still in orbit. Every piece of debris becomes a bullet traveling at 17,500 miles per hour. Hit anything at that speed, and you create more debris, more bullets, more collisions. It's called Kessler Syndrome, a cascade of destruction that could make entire orbits unusable for generations. You've seen the movie Gravity? That scenario isn't science fiction. It's a real possibility. Russia knew this. They did it anyway. What do you think about that? Are satellite jammers weapons? Technically, no. They're designed to cause temporary disruption, not permanent damage. Are anti-satellite missiles weapons? Yes, but they're launched from Earth, not stationed in space. Does blowing up your own satellite violate the treaty? Not explicitly. Cosmos 1408 was a Russian satellite destroyed by a Russian missile. The treaty is being gamed. In December 2024, the UN General Assembly voted 167-4 to reaffirm the Outer Space Treaty, overcoming Russian objections. Russia submitted amendments to expand prohibitions to include any other kinds of weapons, not only weapons of mass destruction, but these were strongly opposed and failed. I think the irony here is delicious. Russia proposes stricter rules while simultaneously blowing up satellites. Since 2008, Russia and China have advocated for a draft treaty on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space, but no agreement has been reached. Meanwhile, everyone's developing counter-space capabilities while arguing about definitions. The 1967 treaty banned nuclear weapons in space, but contained no verification provisions. The current verification regime relies entirely on national technical means, each country's own intelligence capabilities, which lack transparency and provide no mechanism for international response to potential violations. It's an honor system for weapons. In space. Between rivals. Can you believe that? Here's where theories diverge, and honestly, this is where it gets really interesting. Theory 1. America started it. The US launched the first spy satellites in 1960, militarizing space before the Soviets even had their own program running. Reagan's SDI in the 1980s marked a renaissance for military space operations. The establishment of the Space Force in 2019 solidified space as a warfighting domain. From this view, American dominance forced everyone else into an arms race. I've heard this argument from a lot of people, and I get it. America did move first. Theory 2. Everyone's guilty. Soviet proposals for armed satellites and maneuverable spacecraft to ram enemy satellites emerged in the early 1960s. The Soviet Union's Almaz military space station program in the late 1960s included a rapid-fire cannon for self-defense. A cannon. In space. By the mid-1960s, both Corona and Zenit reconnaissance programs were fully operational. Nobody's hands are clean. Space militarization was inevitable the moment both superpowers realized they could see each other from orbit. The treaty was doomed from the start. The truth? I think all of these are partially correct. Space was militarized from the beginning because intelligence gathering is a military function. The treaty banned nukes but allowed everything else because verification was impossible, and neither side wanted to give up advantages. Reagan's SDI accelerated the arms race. China's and Russia's modern capabilities forced America's hand. And now we're here, with satellite jammers, debris clouds, and a space force whose motto is, always above. Was space exploration always about future militarization? Let's be honest. Yes and no. Yes, because much of the early research that led to space exploration began as projects with military implications. The first rockets capable of reaching space were developed as weapon delivery systems. V-2 rockets, remember? And some of the first objects placed in orbit were military satellites. During the Cold War, the space race was partly a contest for military dominance, not just civilian achievement. But also no, because humans genuinely wanted to explore. I believe that. The Apollo program wasn't primarily military. Scientific satellites studying Earth's climate aren't weapons. The International Space Station, where astronauts and cosmonauts work together despite their government's tensions, proves space can transcend nationalism. Here's something I find genuinely fascinating. Spy satellites eliminated the intelligence gap that characterized the early Cold War. They allowed better assessment of military strength, created early warning systems for nuclear attacks, and offered non-invasive verification for arms control treaties. Paradoxically, Space militarization may have prevented World War III by making surprises impossible. The difference now is that we've stopped pretending. The Space Force was established because space had become critical to the U.S. economy and national security. Banking, commerce, travel, entertainment, government functions, military operations, all depend on satellites. Overall funding for space in the DoD budget has more than doubled from $12.6 billion in fiscal year 2018 to $32.9 billion in fiscal year 2019-2024. We've built a civilization that cannot function without space, and now we're turning it into a battlefield. Does that seem smart to you? As of May 2025, 117 countries are parties to the Outer Space Treaty. Every major spacefaring nation has signed it, and every major spacefaring nation is finding creative ways to militarize space without technically breaking it. What does that tell you about how much treaties actually matter when power is on the line? Space isn't the final frontier. It's the next battlefield, one where the consequences of conflict aren't just military defeat, but a debris field that makes orbit unusable for everyone, where humanity's greatest achievement becomes our greatest cage. You know what I think? The cosmos doesn't care about our treaties or our weapons. It offers infinite space for both cooperation and conflict. Which one we choose will determine whether our descendants look up at a sky full of possibilities or down at the ruins of a civilization that militarized itself into irrelevance. And that's terrifying. But it's also still our choice to make. You're the kind of person who doesn't just want the headlines. You want the real story, the human cost, the engineering truth. Subscribe to join a community that looks beyond the myths and into the extraordinary reality of space exploration.